Steve from blessedhopeforever.com. Today we're going to talk about where in the world is the devil in all of this that's going on. As of mid-2025, there are still 28 UN member states that don't recognize Israel. These include 15 members of the Arab League, 10 non-Arab members of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and 3 other UN member states. Several countries have suspended or cut diplomatic relations with Israel over time. Iran doesn't hide its hatred for Israel. No diplomatic ties since 1979. It views Israel's statehood as invalid. It wants it wiped off the map. It's difficult to give an exact number for unfriendly nations to Israel at the present time. However, if we count countries that do not recognize Israel, the number is 28. If we also include countries that have suspended or cut relations with Israel, the number increases. Some countries might have diplomatic relations but are still seen as unfriendly. For example, Norway has recently been described as having a diplomatic crisis with Israel. So the number of countries that do not recognize Israel as of the making of this video is 28. The global political landscape is constantly shifting, so these numbers are really subject to change. Now, I went researching for facts and data surrounding this subject, and I want to talk about that. Surprisingly, the number of countries considered unfriendly to Israel has decreased since 2000, primarily due to an increase in diplomatic recognition. And in the year 2000, a list of countries that did not recognize Israel would have included most of the Arab League states and many other Muslim-majority nations. Since 2000, the turn of the century, notably with the Abraham Accords in 2020, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco have all established or normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. The significantly reduced number here of countries that actively refuse to recognize Israel is apparent. So while there are still 28 UN member states that don't recognize Israel as of today, this number has shrunk from what it would have been in 2000. Now, according to my research, the overall trend since 2000 has been towards increased recognition and normalization rather than a significant increase in countries actively hostile or without any form of diplomatic ties. Wanting Israel destroyed seems to kind of go against prophecy here. But I want to try to explain that. The general trend over the past 2 decades has been a lessening of the number of countries considered unfriendly to Israel. Okay? So, what year was the number the greatest? That's what I was wondering. And so I embarked on a journey to find out. And I learned that the number of countries considered unfriendly to Israel, specifically in terms of non-recognition or severed diplomatic ties, was at its greatest following the 1967 Six-Day War and the 73 Yom Kippur War. In the aftermath of this war, many countries under pressure from Arab nations and the Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations with Israel. There was a resolution in September of 1967 issued by the Arab League, famously and included this phrase, the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. And this significantly impacted Israel's diplomatic standing on the global stage. And many Eastern countries also severed ties with Israel in 1967. And the 73 Yom Kippur War led to further diplomatic breaks, with countries cutting ties. An oil embargo imposed by Arab oil-producing countries also put significant pressure on nations to reconsider their relations with Israel. And then came the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was a year after I got out of the Navy. Now, while Iran initially recognized Israel being the second Muslim majority country to do so after Turkey, the 1979 Islamic Revolution led to the severing of all diplomatic ties and a fundamental shift to open hostility towards Israel. That was 46 years ago this year, 2025. Satan has obviously been busy throughout our lifetimes trying to achieve his goal of destroying Israel. Now, while there have been instances of countries cutting or suspending ties more recently, the sheer number of countries that either refused to recognize Israel from its inception or severed ties in mass after the major Arab-Israeli wars in the late 1960s and early 70s made those periods the peak for unfriendliness in terms of diplomatic isolation. Just the opposite of what I would have guessed. Because one would think that the number of countries unfriendly to Israel would have increased over time, given, prophecy and given the ongoing conflicts in the region. However, the historical context paints an entirely different picture. When Israel was reborn, founded, achieved its statehood in 1948, it was immediately in a state of war with its Arab neighbors, and many countries, particularly those in the Arab and the Muslim world, who refused to recognize Israel's existence. This was a foundational position for a large group of nations. And then comes the Cold War, and during the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli conflict became interwoven with the broader East-West ideological struggle that I knew so well during my time of service. The Soviet Union and its allies often sided with the Arab states, leading many of these countries to either deny recognition to Israel or sever ties with her. And this significantly expanded the number of unfriendly states. And as I mentioned, the Six-Day War, 1967, and the Yom Kippur War, 1973, led to a wave of diplomatic breaks, particularly from African and Asian nations. These events were seen by many as aggressive Israeli actions, further isolating the state internationally. We always have to blame Israel for everything, kind of like, we blame Trump for everything. So the tide then shifted with peace treaties. The peace treaties with Egypt, 1979, and Jordan, 1994, were significant breakthroughs, reducing the number of directly hostile Arab states. Satan hates peace treaties. He sees that they could be effective, however, so that's why, at least one reason why he decides to introduce a false treaty later. And then came the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, which removed a major geopolitical dynamic that had fueled opposition to Israel. And this led to a period of increased diplomatic engagement and recognition, especially from former Soviet countries and many African nations. And then here comes the Abraham Accords in 2020. The recent normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco represent a major shift in the Arab world, further reducing the number of countries without diplomatic ties to Israel. So, while conflicts continue and some countries remain vehemently opposed to Israel, the peak of its diplomatic, I guess what you'd call isolation, and the sheer number of countries actively refusing to recognize it or having severed ties occurred in the mid to late 20th century, particularly after the major wars. And since then, the trend, despite setbacks, has been towards greater recognition and normalized relations. So what am I to make of this increase in friendliness, I'll put that in quotes, in light of biblical eschatology that seems to project just the opposite? Especially considering the recent sharp rise in anti-Semitism. Many prophecies speak of the Jewish people being regathered to their ancient homeland in the last days. Ezekiel chapter 36, Isaiah chapter 11, and the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 48 is a fulfillment of this. And alongside the gathering, many prophecies depict Israel as being surrounded by hostile nations, facing a final great military coalition, often referred to as the Gog and Magog War, Ezekiel 38, 39. And this coalition is typically described as coming from the far north and including nations like Persia, Iran, Libya, Ethiopia, among others. The idea is that in the very end, Israel will be isolated and seemingly on its own against a united front of enemies. Now, Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7 speaks of a time of trouble for Jacob, a period of intense tribulation for Israel before their ultimate deliverance and their national restoration, their deliverance. While not always explicitly tied to a global alliance against Israel, the Bible also suggests a continued hostility towards the Jewish people throughout history, culminating in intense persecution in the final last of the last days, the end times, the end of the end times. Revelation 12, Matthew 24, I think Luke 21. There has been an apparent increase in diplomatic friendliness toward Israel, the Abraham Accords being a prime example. And we were told that a period of relative peace or increased diplomatic ties could precede the final prophesied conflict. You know, when they say peace and safety. Now, this might be seen as a deceptive peace that kind of lulls Israel into a false sense of security, making them vulnerable to the sudden attack mentioned in Ezekiel 38, where Israel is described as dwelling safely. The covenant of peace, so-called, that the Antichrist is prophesied to make with Israel in Daniel chapter 9, also falls into this category, being a temporary agreement that is ultimately broken. Devil can't keep his word on anything. While some nations might establish diplomatic ties, these alliances could be seen as primarily strategic, driven by shared economic or geopolitical interests. You know, for example, countering Iran rather than deep unconditional friendship in the biblical sense, but the underlying spiritual animosity will remain despite Trump's efforts, despite others' efforts to the contrary, despite the UN's efforts, whoever, Even with new diplomatic ties, the number of nations that actively do not recognize Israel or have hostile intentions will still be significant, and perhaps more importantly, the intensity of that hostility from key prophetic players like Iran will increase. It has to. It must. The Bible says it will. The focus in prophecy is often on a specific coalition of nations rather than every single nation on earth. I believe the very act of Israel developing its economy and military and forming some alliances is ironically setting the stage for the final conflict. If Israel were completely, and I mean absolutely 100% completely isolated and weak, well, the prophesied invasion would not make strategic sense. The recent surge in anti-Semitism globally, over 800% is what I've read, is a clear fulfillment of prophecies predicting escalating hatred and persecution against the Jewish people in the last days, the last of the last days. Now, from a biblical perspective, anti-Semitism is not merely a current sociological, dumbed-down, generational, spoiled, rotten brat university problem, okay? Street protest problem. It has deep spiritual roots, a manifestation of satanic opposition to God's chosen people and his plans. I want you to keep in mind how sovereign our God is throughout everything I'm saying here, okay? The increasingly global and covert nature of anti-Semitism in places like the Middle East conflict, and in the U.S., is a distinct prophetic sign. The regathering of Israel combined with the rising of anti-Semitism, even amidst an increase in some diplomatic ties, creates a complex picture that aligns with the multifaceted nature of biblical prophecy, where seemingly contradictory trends can coexist as pieces of a larger prophetic puzzle. The increased friendliness, diplomatic ties, is a temporary or a strategic development that does not necessarily negate the broader biblical prophecies of future isolation and widespread animosity towards Israel. In fact, it might even set the stage for the very conflicts prophesied. The sharp rise in anti-Semitism is seen by many as a more direct and concerning fulfillment of end times predictions regarding the Jewish people. I never thought I'd see what I'm seeing in my lifetime. I never did. And so I went searching for an answer to some questions. One of them being, has Israel won every war it has fought since 1948? You want the answer? No, it has not. It's not accurate to say that Israel has won every war it's fought since 1948 in an unqualified sense. While Israel did achieve decisive military victories in many major conventional wars, particularly in its early decades, what we are witnessing now, folks, is different. What you're seeing now is different. We are seeing conflicts that end without clear-cut objectives being met. That's what I want you to write down, okay? Here, highlight this. Israel successfully defended its newly declared state against a coalition of Arab armies and expanded its territory. This is widely considered a clear victory. In the 1956, the year I was born, Suez Crisis, Israel achieved its military objectives in the Sinai Peninsula, though it later withdrew due to international pressure. But militarily, it was a success. Same with the 1967 Six-Day War. That was a success. That was a stunning and decisive victory for Israel, where it captured significant territories: the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights, and they did it in a very short period of time. And then the 1973 Yom Kippur War, while initially caught by surprise and suffering heavy losses, Israel ultimately somehow managed to push back the invading Egyptian and Syrian forces across the Suez Canal and encircle the Egyptian Third Army. This was an army. This was a conventional war, folks, and it achieved a military stalemate that led to significant political gains, like a peace treaty with Egypt. Many consider that a strategic victory, though a costly one. But in short, God protected his people through those conventional wars. And then the nature of warfare changed. During the 1982 Lebanon War, First Lebanon War, Israel invaded Lebanon with the stated goal of expelling the PLO. And while the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was indeed expelled, the war became prolonged, controversial, and led to the rise of Hezbollah. Israel's withdrawal from most of Lebanon by 1985 and then completely in 2000 without achieving all its long-term objectives makes this outcome less of a clear win, in my opinion. Some argue it was a strategic failure because it led to a more determined enemy on its northern border. And then came the 2006 Lebanon War, Second Lebanon War. And this conflict with Hezbollah ended in a UN brokered ceasefire. Israel inflicted heavy damage on Hezbollah, but it failed to disarm the group or retrieve its captured soldiers through military means, and Hezbollah's rocket capabilities remained intact and over time even improved. Now, I got to say, God is still protecting his people, Israel, but things obviously took a turn. And many analysts, including within Israel, consider this an inclusive or an inconclusive conflict, or even a strategic setback for Israel. And then now we see conflicts in Gaza, Operation Cast Lead, 2008 and 9, Operation Protective Edge, 2014, and ongoing conflicts today. We see significant Israeli military action to degrade capabilities and restore deterrence. Israel typically achieves its immediate military objectives of suppressing rocket fire and destroying infrastructure, but these conflicts haven't led to a long-term resolution or the complete elimination of the threat. The cycle of violence resumes. I wouldn't consider these wins in a broader strategic sense. Israel's military is highly effective, and it's demonstrated superior capabilities in conventional warfare. However, the nature of conflict has evolved. Winning is often defined not just by battlefield dominance, but by achieving political objectives and long-term security. In recent decades, particularly against non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas, achieving a definitive win has proven more elusive, leading to more ambiguous outcomes. So, there is an obvious contrast between the victories of 1948, 1973, and the more elusive victories from 1982 to the present. This is a generally accepted analysis of Israeli military history. There is a clear and a significant contrast between the decisive victories of the 1948-1973 period and the more elusive victories or ambiguous outcomes from 1982 onward. And here's why this contrast exists. The nature of the adversaries. In 48 to 73, you were looking at conventional state armies versus, in 1982 to the present, non-state actors with hybrid warfare. The fact is, the 82 Lebanon War marked a pivot. while the initial phase involved conventional fighting against Syrian forces and the PLO, the prolonged occupation and subsequent conflicts have predominantly been against non-state actors like the PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., etc. If I said to you folks, listen to me, if I said guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics using ambushes, hit and run attacks, rockets, suicide bombings, and tunnel warfare, and operating within civilian populations, blurring the lines between combatants and non-combatants, making conventional military responses more difficult and controversial. You'd probably think I was talking about Hamas, Gaza. And yet, to me, that sounds a whole lot like Vietnam. Look, in the earlier wars, there were clear objectives. In 48, the objective was survival and statehood. In 56 and 67, it was about preemptive strikes to secure borders and gain strategic depth. In 1973, it was about recovering from surprise and reestablishing deterrence. These wars had relatively clear military and political objectives that could be achieved through decisive conventional force. But that all changed with Lebanon in 82. The goal initially was to remove the PLO threat, but it quickly became entangled in Lebanese politics, and it led to the rise of Hezbollah. In the Gaza conflicts, the objectives are often about restoring deterrence, degrading capabilities, or stopping rocket fire, which are inherently short-term and tactical, rarely leading to a fundamental change in the long-term threat. Winning becomes much harder to define when the enemy can simply endure and reconstitute, or when the objective is to end an insurgency rather than defeat a state army. And when you look back at the early wars, there was less international scrutiny. Relatively speaking, while there was international reaction to early conflicts, the scrutiny was different. The global media landscape was different, and human rights concerns were not as globally relevant as they are today. And they now draw immense international media attention, much from a fake news media. Human rights monitoring and the UN involvement. And this often puts pressure on Israel to limit collateral damage and avoid prolonged operations. Domestically, if as far as Israel is concerned, these conflicts have also led to more significant internal debates and divisions within Israeli society, particularly regarding the human and economic costs of sustained occupations or prolonged engagements. Times have indeed changed, dearly beloved, for Israel, for us, in fact, the world, when it comes to the subject of warfare. Warfare. I look at that prophetic evolution of warfare as significant time-wise. God designed, God purposed. He has been bringing his people back into the land for judgment and deliverance. Therefore, this distinct shift in the nature of Israeli victories from clear-cut military triumphs against state armies to more elusive and ambiguous outcomes against non-state actors in hybrid warfare scenarios is very accurate. And furthermore, the devil, out to destroy Israel, is obviously changing his tactics since earlier conventional warfare failed in achieving his objectives. Satan's ultimate goal is to thwart God's plans. And if God's plans involve the continued existence and ultimate redemption of Israel, then it just follows that the devil would continually attempt to destroy Israel. And given the observation that conventional military tactics failed to achieve the destruction of Israel in its early wars, thanks to God's intervention, the devil changing tactics becomes a plausible interpretation for the shift towards asymmetric warfare, inciting non-state actors like terrorist groups to engage in guerrilla warfare. We entered into a state of that in 2001 or before, okay? Terrorist groups where they engage in guerrilla warfare, rocket attacks, suicide bombings that are harder for a conventional military to decisively win against. The devil's ultimate goal remains the same: wipe Israel off the map. But his methods adapt to the circumstances and to what has proven effective or ineffective in the past. Since direct military conquest by state armies failed, then a more insidious, multifaceted approach that combines physical attacks with psychological, political, and spiritual warfare would be the logical next step. I think this idea allows us to reconcile the apparent paradox of Israel achieving diplomatic normalization with some states while simultaneously facing escalating threats of other kinds and a global rise in anti-Semitism, viewing it all as part of a larger spiritual battle. Our great adversary, the devil, has become more desperate. All right. This is a sign of the times. This kind of tells you where we're at on the prophetic timeline. At least it helps. From a theological perspective, we see Satan becoming more desperate as the end times draw nearer. Revelation 12:12 states, "Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He's filled with fury because he knows his time is short." The devil becomes increasingly aware that his window of opportunity to oppose God is narrowing. As his time shortens, his fury, his wrath intensifies. And this heightened desperation and malice would naturally lead to more aggressive, varied, and perhaps cunning tactics. If conventional warfare failed to annihilate Israel, then shifting to methods that sow chaos, division, and undermine from within, or to proxy wars and international delegitimization campaigns, it makes all the sense in the world, folks. So considering the context of Revelation 12:12, just when did the devil come down? When did the devil come down to Georgia? All right, I threw that in for free. The word there is katabino. It's an aorist active indicative. The use of the aorist active indicative for katabino, bino, to come down, descend in Revelation 12:12 is crucial for understanding the timing. While the aorist tense often refers to a past action in Greek, it's not simply a past tense in the same way that we talk about that in the English. The aorist describes an action as a completed event without necessarily specifying when that event occurred relative to the speaker's present. It can be a simple past, a succinct aorist, a general truth, or even a futuristic aorist where a future event is spoken of as if it's already happened to emphasize its certainty. Now, in the context of Revelation 12, there are a few primary interpretations of when the devil came down. Just about like there is with every verse. There's always, a number of views. One interpretation is that this is a pre-creation, Satan's original fall, pre-creation, Eden. They argue that this passage is referring to Satan's initial rebellion against God before he even created us, when he was cast out of heaven. Okay? That's, and they point to passages like Luke chapter 10. I saw Satan fall like lightning from the heaven, in Isaiah or Ezekiel, passages, so in this view, the aorist would refer to a definitive past event. However, a challenge to this view is that other scriptures like Job, chapters 1 and 2, and Zechariah chapter 3 show Satan still having access to God's presence in heaven to accuse people, the brethren, which would contradict a complete banishment at the original fall. And then there are those who hold to Christ's first advent, crucifixion, resurrection. That Satan's definitive casting down occurred with Christ's victory on the cross and his resurrection. This is a very strong theological interpretation. Jesus said in John chapter 12, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out." And in Colossians chapter 2, Paul states that Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. And so from this perspective, Christ's death and resurrection decisively defeated Satan's power and authority, essentially evicting him from his place of accusation in heaven. And the aorist here would signify a completed historical event with profound and ongoing consequences. This doesn't mean that Satan is powerless, but his access and authority are fundamentally broken. And then there's the future end-time event interpretation. This is arguably the most common interpretation in dispensational and futurist views of Revelation. I'm a dispensationalist. I'm a literalist. I take Scripture literally. And in this understanding, Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9 describes a literal future war in heaven between Michael and his angels and Satan and his angels, resulting in Satan's final expulsion from the heavenly realms where he currently operates. Not necessarily God's throne room. The voice from heaven in 12 verses 10 through 12 then announces this completed future event. In this case, the aorist is understood as a futuristic aorist, declaring a future event as certain as if it's already happened. This event is often placed during the tribulation period, likely in its middle, immediately preceding the woe to the earth that follows due to the devil's increased fury and wrath. And so, just when did the devil come down to Georgia, so to speak? Well, given the immediate context of Revelation 12, where the casting down of the dragon, Satan, by Michael is explicitly described, verses 7 through 9, before the voice declares the devil has come down, many scholars, especially those with a futurist leaning, interpret this as a future event that will occur during the end times. The aorist in 12:12 emphasizes the certainty and decisiveness of this future expulsion. It's going to happen. It implies that while Satan has been a spiritual adversary throughout history and his power was broken at the cross, there is a specific future point where his access to the heavenly realms to accuse believers will be definitely and permanently terminated, resulting in his complete confinement to the earth for a specific short time before his ultimate binding. This is the point when his wrath will intensify on earth, because he knows that his remaining time is truly short. So you take your pick. Basically, it's pre-creation, it's first advent, or it's the tribulation period. More specifically, I think the midpoint. That seems to align better with Scripture than the beginning of the tribulation. Those are the three primary interpretations for the timing of Satan's coming down in Revelation 12:12, based on the aorist active indicative, the grammar. Now, I do not believe Revelation 12:12 is referring to the present church age dispensation of grace. I do not believe that. The church age is generally not considered the period when Satan is definitively cast down in the sense of Revelation 12:12, for those that take Scripture literally. And so, during the current church age, Satan still has access to the heavenly realms to act as the accuser of the brethren. He's standing there before God day and night accusing you. And of course, Jesus is pointing to the blood. So you can bemoan your sins all you want, but that's what's happening. Okay? Now, if he were already cast down in the final sense of Revelation 12:12, this ongoing role as accuser would be difficult to reconcile. So he hasn't been cast down yet. That's what I'm going to tell you. Now, you don't have to agree with me, but that's what I'm going to say. And for those who hold the tribulation period view, this short time refers to the final 3.5 years of the tribulation. Okay? The war in heaven, Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 9, and Satan's expulsion are placed during the future tribulation, specifically at its midpoint. This distinct event is what triggers the woe to the earth, because Satan's activity becomes concentrated entirely on the earthly plane. Therefore, within a literal, futurist, and dispensational interpretation, the coming down of the devil in Revelation 12:12 is not a characteristic event of the present church age in which we are now living. Okay? Instead, the church age is seen as a period where Satan is still active as the god of this age. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. And the prince of the power of the air, that's Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2. He is still the accuser of the brethren, Revelation 12:10, operating from the heavenly realms. We are engaged in spiritual warfare against him and his demonic forces. That's Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. His power is certainly limited by God and ultimately broken by Christ's death and resurrection, but he is not yet fully confined to the earth in the way described in Revelation 12:12. The church age is a unique dispensation where God is building his church, drawing believers from all nations, before the focus shifts back to Israel in the tribulation period. Satan is said to accuse the brethren day and night, which infers he still has access to God's throne. And in my opinion, that strengthens the argument against Satan having already been cast down in the final sense of Revelation 12:12 during this present church age. The accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night, says verse 10 of Revelation chapter 12. The phrase, who accuses them before our God day and night, explicitly describes Satan's ongoing activity. If he were already cast down to earth in the sense of Revelation 12:12, he would no longer have access before our God in the heavenly courts to perform this accusation. Therefore, if Revelation 12:12, Satan cast down, were a past event like pre-creation or first advent, it'd be very difficult to reconcile with Satan's continued role as accuser day and night in the heavenly realm. The casting down in 12:12 implies a cessation of that heavenly access. If Revelation 12:12, Satan cast down as a future event, tribulation midpoint, this interpretation perfectly harmonizes with 12:10, in my opinion. During the current church age, Satan is the accuser who has access to God's presence. The throwing down mentioned in 12:10 is then understood to be the announcement of his future expulsion, described in chapter 12, verses 7 through 9, by the voice in heaven after the heavenly war occurs. When he's finally thrown down, then the accuser will have been silenced from that position. So, the very fact that Satan is still described as accusing the brethren day and night today in the present church age strongly infers that he still has access to the heavenly realm where he can stand before God, and he's not yet been cast down to earth in the final decisive manner described in Revelation 12:12. And this makes the tribulation period interpretation for 12:12, I think, in my opinion, the most accurate. Okay? So let's factor that cast down timing into his change in tactics to asymmetric warfare from previous conventional warfare defeats. Let's try to connect the theological interpretation of Satan's casting down to the historical shift in warfare tactics against Israel. Now, if we take the tribulation period view for Revelation 12:12, where Satan's definitively cast down to earth, knowing his time is short, and we observe the shift in warfare tactics against Israel, a compelling narrative emerges. Conventional armies are strong against other conventional armies. They're less effective and often constrained when facing enemies embedded in civilian clothes and civilian populations using tunnels and rockets and unconventional methods. This is a tactical adaptation by the adversary, is what it is. So, and it generates international condemnation. Asymmetric warfare often leads to higher civilian casualties due to the nature of the fighting and the deliberate use of human shields by the non-state actors. This generates international outrage and pressure against Israel, which becomes a form of political warfare that a conventional military victory does not achieve. This is a powerful new front in the war against Israel's survival. Draining resources and will, prolonged, inconclusive, asymmetric conflicts drain a nation's resources. It erodes public morale. It fosters internal divisions, all without the need for a decisive military victory. This is the precursor stage, folks, that we're living in. Precursor to the final cast down wrath. From the desperate devil perspective, this shift in tactics is a prelude to his ultimate casting down. He's trying everything in his playbook to destabilize Israel, wear it down, isolate it before his time runs out. The increasing anti-Semitism globally fits this narrative. It's a broader attack on the Jewish people, attempting to make them unwelcome and unsafe worldwide. This future casting down, mid-trib, when it happens, when Satan's finally cast down to earth, knowing his time is truly short, for the final 3.5 years, his tactics are expected to reach a crescendo of great wrath, probably unlike anything the world's ever seen. Well, not probably, certainly. The ultimate global coalition against Israel and the intense persecution described in Revelation. And from this theological perspective, the historical shift in warfare against Israel from direct state-on-state conventional armies, against armies, attacks, to complex asymmetric conflicts involving non-state actors and political warfare and rising anti-Semitism is seen as evidence of a strategic adaptation by a desperate spiritual adversary having failed to destroy Israel through conventional means. The devil is perceived as employing more insidious and multifaceted tactics, knowing that his ultimate defeat is near and his time to act is progressively shortening towards that final casting down at the midpoint in the tribulation. This is what I want you to see. If that is not a sign of our times, I don't know what is. Look, I love you all. I truly do. Rest in Him. Until next time, thanks for watching.